the well-being of LGBTQ plus people in the city and greater Dublin region. And we do this by being a safe space for community to do 4 very important things. The first is connection. We're a place to come and discover your people, your place, your passions. It's a place to come for community support, to access programs, services, and information. It's a place to come and experience the joy of culture and discovery and everything that queer joy has to bring to our lives. And lastly, it's a place to campaign from and to join a very credible and trusted voice for our communities. And there are 3 issues that Outhouse leads on nationally within our community, and they are poverty, which disproportionately affects our community and is rife in our society at the moment, homelessness and housing, which is having a massive impact right across all of society, but disproportionately affecting queer people in particular. And lastly, the safety of our community. And last year was the most violent year on record, with hate crime targeting our community up 29%, and tragically 2 murders. And this is all set against the backdrop of the existential threat of climate change. And we know that from whatever major societal upheavals take place, it is those who are most vulnerable or most marginalised experience the brute effects of those societal upheavals and changes. So I'm very interested to hear what you all have to say on these in particular tonight, and thank you for being with us. And over to Anne. Thank you.
Well, Father Oisin, I just want to thank Outhouse, first of all, for facilitating our Pride political debate. And it's been running now since 2014, for 1 year. It didn't run last year. So we're very glad to be back, and we want to welcome you to the debate. So it's going to be a relatively free-flowing discussion, kind of a round table is how we've decided to do it. And then there will be a Q&A maybe in the last half an hour of proceedings, and that will allow the audience to come in. So please do, absolutely do come in with your questions. And here's Vanna. Hi, Vanna. So Vanna, yes, you probably just introducing everyone. So absolutely. So we would very much encourage audience participation, and I'm sure you have many questions that you would like to ask. So I'm going to introduce my panelists now, and I'll begin with Ivana. So Ivana Lapchik will be familiar to many of you. She's a very long-standing ally of the LGBT community and progressive social change more generally. Ivana has been the leader of the Labour Party since, am I right, Ivana, was 2022? Yes. And before that, Ivana served as the Labour Party leader in the Senate and was Senator since 2007. So you're very welcome, Ivana, and looking forward as always to your thoughts. Next to Ivana, then we have Senator Barry Ward, and Barry is a Labour Senator, and he hails from the constituency of John Leary. Barry was a Senator since 2020 and previously served as a councillor of the John Leary Rathdown County Council since 2009. So next then we have Sinn Féin TD, Louise O'Reilly, and Louise represents Dublin Fingal constituency, having first been elected in 2016. And Louise serves as her party's spokesperson on workers' rights, enterprise, trade and employment. And then last, but certainly not least, we have Councillor Alan Edge. And Alan has been a councillor on South Dublin County Council since 2019. Yes, not 2014, we established that earlier on. And Alan is, as well as being a councillor, he's very outspoken and vocal advocate for LGBT plus and for equality issues. And he served as the first chair of the steering group to, the committee really, to outlaw convergent practices. And then my own name, I'm Adam Long, and I'm board director with the National LGBT Federation. And we would be one of the oldest continuous LGBT plus NGOs in the country. We were founded in 1979, and you might remember the Hirschfield Centre back in the 1980s. Well, the NGF, as we were then called, that was under our auspices, and that was really an incredible space, particularly for the era, community space like that. I suppose for kind of a pre-outhouse, really, you could say. So that's the panel, and I think I was thinking actually before we get into kind of the main, there are so many topics to discuss, so many pressing issues, but I think it would be appropriate maybe if I just say at the outset, because I think this year in particular, it's really never been more important, I would say, for those who support the LGBT plus community, particularly allies, to really be vocal and to really be visible in that allyship. Because we have come a long way and we've made a lot of progress, but there's nothing, progress doesn't necessarily follow a linear direction. And it's a small element, you could say, but there is an emboldened element now in our society who are very much seeking to turn the clock backwards. And they're seeking to undo the rights that we have, and then they're seeking to prevent further progress. And I think Ireland is lucky in the sense that we don't have the kind of political polarisation that you see in the United States, for example, where things have got very extreme, and where the Human Rights Campaign have called a state of emergency for the LGBT plus community in America. The same with our nearest neighbour across the Irish Sea in the UK. We've seen really toxic culture wars take hold there and really gain traction. So ever, we absolutely need our political leaders, we need civil society leaders to really stand with us and to make absolutely clear that whatever about other parts of the world, Ireland will very much be a beacon for equality, for progressive social policy. And I think it was just important to say that at the outset, because I know a lot of people, and I think we'll see it on Saturday as well, a lot of people really feel that this year in particular does feel different. And it feels more important than ever that Pride, I suppose, is a protest, first and foremost. It's rooted in politics, ultimately. And I really hope that we see that and that we make absolutely clear that Ireland needs to be proactive and needs to be explicit, actually, in moving forwards and not allowing any of this manufactured and contrived culture war nonsense, really, to take hold in our society. We have a lot to be proud of. We have a lot to be optimistic about, and we have a lot to be, happy about. But we can't be complacent. And I just thought it was important to say that at the outset. So, thank you. So, in terms of our busy agenda that we have this evening, I think it would be right to start with hate and hate crime. It kind of follows actually naturally, anyway, from what I've just been talking about. And we have seen, and Ocean referenced it there in his introduction, a nearly 30% increase in hate-motivated attacks for 2022. And that's really only the surface, because we know it's a vastly underreported crime. So we now have legislation that's before the Oireachtas, very welcome legislation, the Hate Offences Bill, and it's something actually that we've been calling for in the LGBT plus community for many years now. So I suppose when we hear that the debate has been rushed, or that there hasn't really been consultation around this legislation, it actually feels very different. In our community, it feels like we've been waiting too long, in fact, for kind of effective and for robust hate crime. So I might begin with you, Evanna. So the Labour Party, you're supportive of the legislation. I've seen you voting in that way.
Yes. First, just to apologise for being a little late. I know, Adam, you were trying to ring me. I was literally pedalling up the street on my bike, so I couldn't take the call. But delighted to be here again. I spoke at the Pride debate last year that Adam organised, and it's always a really nice occasion to mark Pride Week and indeed Pride Month. So delighted to be here, and particularly this year as we mark the 30th anniversary of decriminalisation. And actually we had a conference I spoke at along with Kieran Rose and others in Trinity just 3 weeks ago, where we spoke about just about the progress that had been made over the 30 years, how we got to this point, and also then picking up the theme Adam has about how we can ensure there's no falling backwards with the growth of the far right and the growth of this really nasty element that we're seeing, albeit not in represented happening in all in mainstream politics in any way, but certainly we're seeing it in terms of the protests outside libraries, you'll have seen, and the protests outside centres where people are coming to seek refuge from other countries. We're seeing some rise of racism, rise of homophobia, and so on. That's very worrying. So it's in that context we're debating the hate crime bill. Yes, we in Labour do support it, and indeed, for a long time we've been pushing for this legislation to come in, because part of the difficulty in Ireland with this phenomenon of hate crime is that we've never had a legal definition. We've had incitement to hatred legislation, which has been largely ineffective. And I should say I speak as a criminal defence barrister in the past, and Nick Barry also as a barrister. So, I think anyone with any knowledge of the law will know that there hasn't been effective legislation to tackle hate crime. And a huge problem is we don't even know the true extent of it. There are some statistics kept by NGOs, and the Guards have started to keep statistics, but there's no specific definition in law of, there's nothing to demarcate an offence, for example, an assault that's motivated by homophobia, as against an assault that has no ulterior, that has no other motivation, that's not motivated by hate. So we're very supportive of this. Not just gay rights groups, LGBT groups, but also, traveller rights groups, Immigrant Council of Ireland, Refugee Council, so many civil society groups have long sought hate crime law. Yes, there is a sort of narrative growing in Russia without consultation. I have to say, I think that narrative has been pushed by those who don't want to see this legislation in. We're seeing, aren't we, really all of us in the Dáil channel, a really orchestrated campaign against the hate crimes bill. And it's largely coming from a position of people who don't want to see hatred as a motivator in our criminal law. And we fundamentally disagree with that. I think it's very important for many practical and symbolic reasons that there would be laws specifically targeting offences motivated by hatred. So,
Thank you. I should just say before I bring in Barry, perhaps, there's a coalition against hate crime that's over. There's 23 of us as part of that. And, it's obviously a disparate kind of coalition, but we're all very much agreed on the need. We all broadly support the bill, and we very much believe that it needs now to be enacted without further delay. And certainly within the National LGBT Federation, it really is the priority. It's probably our priority legislative issue this year, in fact. And of course, the criminal law alone, isn't the answer, but it is a vital tool as part of the broader, let's say, suite of measures to really kind of make, for Ireland, for society to make clear that we will not tolerate hate crime. And when incitement reaches that level where it goes into criminality, and of course Ireland already has, because if you're right, Ivana, this legislation has been subject to a lot of disinformation and to a lot of muddying of the waters. So we don't have any hate crime legislation, so we're only catching up in that respect. We are an outlier in the Western world. But in terms of the incitement, which is where a lot of the disinformation, I think, is focused upon, it's conveniently ignored that we have had, or we already do have, hate speech legislation dating back to 1989. So it's a misnomer to say that we're introducing something radical, or this is some kind of, I've heard phrases like tall police and tall crime and all this kind of thing, except to say that the 89 Act obviously is no longer fit for purpose in a time when we have when the online space is such a kind of a forceful part of our world and our society. So it's right, I think, that we do update that legislation. So I think it's important that we kind of meet the disinformation with actually facts around this very important bill. Barry, you were very, I think, bullish, I've heard being described, your contribution in the challenge around this issue.
Yeah, thanks very much. Sorry, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I agree with what you've just said there about the prohibition of the Hatred Act 1989. It is, when you think about it, 1989 was a different time in so many respects, and not least because we didn't all have the internet in our pockets. There have only been in that time 50 prosecutions under that act, so it tells you just how ineffective it's been. So I agree with what you said. We are an outlier. We are one of only 4 countries in the European Union that doesn't have this kind of legislation, and the only one in the Western part of the European Union. So we are way behind that. And it has been knocking around for a long time. This was raised with the Taoiseach today in the working group of committee chairs of the Raptors, and he made exactly this point. There has been consultation, there has been consideration, there has been debate, there has been long debate, particularly about this bill. So it's not new and it's not radical. In fact, I personally think it isn't radical enough because there's still lots of room in it to allow for what people term freedom of speech. And extraordinarily, I think in the Dáil it went through relatively straightforwardly. There was only one or two voices of dissent. The Shannon experience has been very, very different. And there are 2 or 3 senators in particular who have voiced very significant opposition to the bill. And the word that was used by you there was misinformation. One of the senators before the debate did a video in which he said this was a very important day for Ireland because today we're debating a bill that was going to take away your freedom of expression. And it's just so callous, so wrong, so incorrect to say things like that. That the reason I was bullish was I was at the end of my tether, having been through this debate with them already on this issue. That misinformation is not just misinformation, it's extraordinarily damaging. Because there are other people who may not be part of this debate in real terms. There are people who are at the blunt end of hate crime and hate speech. There are other people who are lucky enough not to be in that space, not to be in one of the protected characteristics, and not to have to worry about this on a day-to-day. And they could listen to that Twitter video and say, well, I value my freedom of expression. I don't want that to go away. I don't agree with the government putting in place legislation that tells me I can't think certain things. So that post-policing argument that came through, absolute nonsense. And one of the things I said during that speech is you can continue to think hateful things. You can continue to be an offensive individual. That's not going to be against the law. More is the pity in some instances. But you can still do that. What you can't do is take those stupid thoughts, those wrong thoughts, and translate them into action. That's what the bill is going to outlaw. So if you take your hatred of a particular group, be it LGBT, be it because of someone's religion, their nationality, their ethnicity, whatever it might be, if you take that and then translate it into action that is likely to incite hatred or violence, and that's an important part, then that's an offence. And it should be. And the thing about it is, everybody deep down knows that it should be. And the arguments that they've mentioned in relation to the bill as well are absolutely ancillary to it. There's no definition of hate. Well, I ask you, does anybody not know what the word hate means? Does anybody not know what we're talking about when we say you're not allowed to incite violence or hatred through hate? Or hate speech. Nobody's in any doubt. But what they want to do is they want to define hate in narrow parameters so that they can continue to act outside those parameters. So if you say hate means A, B, C, then surely when the law turns around, somebody will come around and say, well, I wasn't A, B, C, I was B, and I wasn't in the definition. So you not only now have to prove the intent or the recklessness to commit the offence, you now have to prove that it falls within the definition of the act as well.
Barry, do you think defining hatred, that would make the law too prescriptive, and would it make the threshold too high?
Yeah.
For prosecution? Is that essentially the
exactly. The thing, as Hannah mentioned, I'm a criminal defence barrister, so unfortunately my job is in the context of exactly this, not necessarily hate crime, but in terms of prosecution for criminal offences is to find where something falls outside the law. And there are teams of barristers down the road from here whose job it is to do that all day, every day. There is a set of legislation in this country called the Interpretation Act, the most recent one I think was 2005. And basically what it says is when a word has an ordinary meaning, but it has a meaning that we all understand, you don't have to define it in legislation. We define terms in legislation all the time because they have either a very, very specific meaning according to that piece of legislation, or they're a new term or a term where there might be some vagueness about what they mean. Hate is not such a term. Everybody understands it. And the danger is, as I say, if you say hate means this, that, and the other, then somebody will find something outside this, that, and the other. They'll do that and they'll claim that it's not covered by the law. And I hate the word loophole. As a criminal defence barrister, I consider that there are no loopholes. There is the law and there is not the law. And much of what people complain about as being loopholes are actually protections that are built in for us all. But this is the definition of the dangerous. If you narrowly define something, you are creating an out clause, if I can put it that way, rather than a loophole. You're creating a way in which somebody can escape what we all intend as part of the law.
I suppose it's just, and the minister actually, a lot of LGBT groups met with the Taoiseach and senior ministers in government buildings. It's a quite one to forget what day you had. I think it was maybe 2 days ago, 3 days ago. And actually the minister, your colleague, did make that point that she has been advised now by 2 attorney generals that it would be too problematic to define it. Having said that, I suppose a lot of groups still do kind of want to maybe kind of and have called for it to be defined kind of more clearly. And I suppose in terms of, because yes, I think ultimately a lot of arguments are being kind of manufactured against this bill, and they're proxy arguments. They're ultimately culture war stuff. And I would kind of caution everyone that's ultimately what it comes down to. But I do think that's been one of the issues that's kind of maybe a hook of criticism against this bill, is that it's too vague and it's too nebulous. And we can think that that's a problem in terms of the, let's say, the critics of the bill.
I don't think it's a problem. I think they, as you said, they've created arguments against it. Make no mistake, hate will be interpreted by the courts. So there will be cases where they challenge a particular action, and it'll be up to judges to decide whether it falls within hate or not. But I don't think that there's really any doubt about this. I don't think anybody in this room, for example, has any doubt about what we mean when we talk about hate speech. And many of you will probably have experienced it, if not all of you. So there's no doubt about that. But what will happen is there'll be some borderline case years from now where somebody says, well, actually, it's not technically whatever. And it'll be up to a judge to decide. But that is true in all legislation. And again, there are things in this bill that those people will tell you, the people who are opposing it, are totally new things. They've told us it's going to overturn the burden of proof. So the burden of proof always is the prosecution has to prove the case against you. They're now telling us there's a clause in it that means that you have to prove that you're innocent. Again, not at all true. And if you look at other criminal statutes in Ireland, like the Theft and Foreign Offences Act, like the Firearms and Offensive Weapons Act, like the Misuse of Drugs Act, all of them have what is called a rebuttable presumption. There are lots of places where, in particular circumstances, if you don't explain something, then there's an inference or a presumption that can arise from that. That's normal. It happens in legislation all over the world. They pick this little thing, and they go, look at this, it's a bogeyman. And as you're looking at that, then they convince you there's a problem with it. It's actually quite standard. It is quite fair, I think. And the freedom of speech, again, is still protected by Article 14 of the Constitution. It's still protected by Article 10 of the European Convention. It's specifically protected by Section 11 of the bill as well. So all of those protections are there, but there are also importantly measures that allow the Gardaí to say, that's not okay, and we're going to hold you up for it.
And actually, I'm going to bring in Louise at this point, just to say, I think it's important to know in all these debates to bring it back to the communities that are directly impacted. So as I said, this legislation is badly needed. Communities, as we've discussed, there is now quite a big increase in hate-motivated attacks that are happening. So sometimes these debates can get very abstract and can get very theoretical and can actually lose sight of what we are actually attempting to do here, which is to protect very vulnerable minorities who are feeling very unsettled. And again, I would remind you, the broad civil society space has come together and has called for this legislation to be enacted. And I think that's really crucial. Louise, just your thinking about this bill and where Sinn Féin stands on it.
Well, I think sometimes I like to throw my computer and the contents of it in a very large bin when I read some of the emails that I get. The thought police one is particularly galling. The absolute, total and utter disregard that people have for the communities that this bill seeks to protect. It never fails to amaze and astound me, and the intersection between men and women who have a difficulty with a person's right over their own bodies seem to also, they were medical experts a couple of years ago, they're legal experts now. Don't forget, of course, they were viral experts as well for a while, and also ventilation experts. And they scaled themselves up very, very quickly. Now you have to ask yourself if someone can go from, I'm not going to use a very offensive term, but if someone can go from the type of person who stands outside the dull screaming nonsense of people to an absolute expert on international law and all forms of law, you're going to have to question that, and certainly the quality of the correspondence that they say that they send would undermine their own credibility somewhat, I would say. So it has sparked a debate, and there are people who, and some of them are in Shannon and some of them are in the Dáil, who have used this as an excuse to try to drag us into exactly what you referred to earlier, as those kind of culture wars. I hate that term because it doesn't sound as offensive as it should. And every time we have the debate, and every time hatred, and there is hatred, and the disrespect that we see shown by elected and appointed members of the Seanad and elected members of the law, it underlines for us the need to have protection. Because if you are one of the groups about which this legislation, or about whom this legislation is intended to protect, I can only imagine what it's like to hear some of the stuff that gets said, and some of it's offensive, some of it's horrible, some of it's just bloody wrong. I mean, let's be frank. So I think we do need the legislation. I know that we had, and I'm not even sure that I had an engagement, but I know we put forward some amendments, but I voted for it in the Dáil to let it go through. We want to see it go through. We want to make sure it's robust, fit for purpose, and also is going to stand the test of time, because I think that's very, very important. But for, I suppose, if we get it right, it will be worth having to put up with some of the nonsense if we can get it right. Because people can't say there wasn't a debate, because there has been a debate. They can't say there was a consultation, because that consultation has happened and is ongoing. But I do think the need to update the legislation from 1989, I mean, I'm sure the people in this room weren't even born in 1989, so, you know, we really do need to update the legislation. We are outliers on this, and we shouldn't be, because we have been leaders in this race on more than one occasion, so we need to get back that leadership, get back into that leadership position. Again, I think that's really important, but I don't think legislation on its own is going to do the trick. We need education, and that has to start in our primary schools. And again, same people, they're all experts on education as well, you wouldn't be surprised to know, and specifically the education of primary school, absolute experts in that. Also experts on pornography. They should need any advice, they're also experts on pornography as well. But those self-same people, they will always seek to espouse their views, but the way to counteract that is education, is teaching our young people. And I see my grandson is 7.5, and I see him in school, and he is learning about my body, and you know, and not in an offensive way, but he is learning language that I didn't have till I was an adult. Language that I would be well able for as a child, and children are age appropriate language. And he is he's a beacon of tolerance and respect, and he's learning it in school. He has no idea that he, you know, is tolerant and respectful, because that's just simply how he is, and that's what he's learning in school. But I worry for kids that are not learning that in school, and I worry for kids that don't get that at home. But we can't legislate for that. We have to educate as well as legislate, because legislation on its own will not do what we need it to do. If they punish people, which is good, if they act as a deterrent, which is also good, but education is the key, and starting at the earliest possible age to bring our kids up to be decent, tolerant, respectful.
Again, that's a very good point. And well, education, and we will come to that, that's one of our kind of items, the whole education policy piece. But I think you're right. I think there has to be a whole of society approach, of which the criminal law is an important aspect of it for the reasons you just outlined there, Louise. But then, of course, we need education. We need a broader, you know, I know the Coalition Against Hate Crime is very much talking about a national action plan, for example. So it really is that kind of broad. But I think we also must, you know, not put this cart before the horse. You know, let's have the legislation passed as quickly as possible. I think every day that our communities are exposed, and they are currently exposed, I think is kind of doing a disservice to the LGBT plus community, but also to the other minority communities who have been waiting a long time for this legislation. And, you know, I don't think there is such a thing as perfect law or perfect bill, and people will have disagreements around certain aspects. But again, just to kind of re-emphasise that, you know, the communities who are impacted do very strongly support this bill, and really now do want to see it in the statute books, and kind of no further kind of unnecessary delay. I think that's really important. But I'll just say then as well before I bring in Alan, there were statements in the Dáil, I think yesterday or the day before, around, you know, to mark Pride, and they were overwhelmingly positive, which is absolutely wonderful, and I think we shouldn't perhaps take that for granted. In fact, in the meeting with the Taoiseach and senior government ministers, there was a trans woman from the UK, and she made the point that, you know, that kind of high level engagement, and having, you know, there was a coalition of party leaders there, that really isn't the norm. There's now so much polarisation even in our, in very culturally similar jurisdictions, that it does break down along kind of these party lines. So we should really kind of cherish that. We should really honour that. And again, as part of the kind of the resisting this kind of polarization and this toxicity. And I think your speech was quite good, Louise, because, and unfortunately, again, we've seen it in Shannon, we didn't see it in the Dáil, where it passed by, I think, 110 votes to like 14. But there were people talking about we are being inundated with correspondence, as if this correspondence is somehow reflective or indicative of where the public stand. And you alluded to that in your speech, Louise, and you said that, people trying to claim that they represent the majority, and you're saying a lot of this correspondence is actually quite extreme, and it's a crossover effect. You mentioned virus experts and experts on so many issues. Like, there is such a crossover in this kind of extremist territory, and it is extremist territory. And I would hope that some of your Oireachtas colleagues, some of them, would be alerted to that and would understand that, in fact, this isn't something that the public are hugely exercised about. And to the extent that they are, and we'll come to it in a while, polling shows actually there is an actual representative survey, not an online self-selected survey, which is what's been quoted by the opponents, is 70% in opposition. That was a very leading online poll where people were invited, whereas there was a representative poll by a reputable polling company, and actually the figures there were quite encouraging. It showed broad support. In fact, most, I think, of the population are surprised. You mean we don't have hate legislation already? So I think that's very important to bear in mind. So Alan, your own views on you're LGBT as well. I mean, we kind of know through lived experience, don't we, that this is not some abstract or theoretical debate.
No, absolutely. I think anyone who speaks to members of the LGBT plus community knows that there is an increase. I mean, we know also that the reporting is increased, which is a good thing, but we also know that the volume of hate crimes is increasing, which is really, really worrying. And it's plain for everyone to see, not just the LGBT plus community, but other communities as well. And one thing that's really significant, I think, when you're talking about this argument that this is being rushed, is that the Gardaí are already using their own definition of hate crimes. They're already working on the basis that hate crimes exist. So it's a bizarre situation where law enforcement is actually ahead of the legislation. And so we really need to give them the support that they need. And I know that there was a solidarity rally with refugees on Monday, where there was a small cohort, and it's really important, I think, to keep highlighting that it is a small cohort, a very vocal one, wearing masks and hurling really horrific abuse. And nothing was done. I mean, they might have been moved from one place to another. I mean, that's just the most glaring example of how overdue this legislation is. I practice as a criminal defence barrister myself, just not to be left out here. No, that's all right. But I'm afraid so. But in England and Wales, I practiced in England and Wales, where they've had hate crimes legislation for a long time. So I mean, we shouldn't be looking at this in terms of reinventing the wheel. They've had legislation there. There is no definition of hatred, and in fact, it's been discouraged for the reasons that have already been set out. There's no need to be overly specific. It's a word in common usage. And I think just the one thing I would say just about the nature of the debate in the Shannon in particular, which I was following closely, is where this is coming from. So obviously you've got this issue about the definition of hatred. You've three barristers, one former Reed professor of law saying that this is not necessary. You have two AGs advising the minister that this isn't necessary, but you have these as you say, newfound expertise on behalf of several senators, and then an op-ed in the Irish Times saying that there's issues with the definition of gender. There's no issue with the definition of gender, it's just a definition that they don't perhaps like, but it's there and it's quite clear. So I think what's troubling, one of the first campaigns I worked on was on my J1, San Francisco, 2001, was a campaign to bring in hate crimes legislation after the killing of Matthew Shepard, federal hate crime legislation. And these arguments were about then, so this isn't new, but what's also troubling is that it seems to be coming from the same place. These are not, I'm not going to name a particular senator. I might, no, I won't. With the newfound legal, no, I won't exactly. With newfound legal expertise, this is not coming, from a book of Supreme Court practice. This is coming from a very organised, a very insidious far-right movement, and it's being disseminated. I mean, look, they've got a right to express their views, but we have a right and a duty, I think, to say, look, where is this coming from? This nonsense that you're spouting. So it can't come soon enough. I think it's really good to see it making progress. Long overdue.
Can I ask you, Ivana, just on the hate definitions, are you of that view as well that it would be misguided to define it?
Yeah, Barry's pointed out the interpretation. Barry's pointed out the interpretation point. Yeah, no, I have no difficulty with that in the legislation. We don't do, the incitement, hatred is already in our law. It's already a term we use as far back as 1989. So over 30 years ago, we legislated for this. The problem with that legislation is it's much more narrowly crafted, and the test is much harder for the prosecution to get over to bring home a conviction. So quite a number of convictions were overturned under that legislation, and it really, has been long seen as ineffective. So that's why we needed the new legislation. But the principle you don't need to define hate is the same.
And Barry, again, talking to the minister, earlier in the week, she was very clear that actually the government, of course, will allow debate to continue, but they're not going to allow this to go on indefinitely, and that they will be legislating. I mean, your latest update, I suppose, from government, is government still very much committed to seeing this enacted?
Bill, yeah, in fact, as we raised with the teacher this morning, it has finished second stage of the Shannon now, so we're going into committee stage. There will be 2 stages of amendments. You can be sure there will be amendments submitted. I don't know whether the government will accept any of them or not. No bill is perfect. Every bill benefits from updating and from amendment, but within reason. I haven't seen any. We haven't seen any amendments yet, but I'm quite sure some of them will be offensive, outrageous, absolutely, and we will have to deal with them. But I have no doubt that Helen McEntee is going to take anything like that. So.
And I think as well, gender is very much, I think, being used, and again, it was very kind of illuminating to see the change between the Dáil and the Shannon. So clearly a lot of this kind of organised and kind of contrived kind of opposition and kind of disinformation, because in many ways, what I was struck by, let's say the voices who were against the legislation, they were almost arguing about, it was like a proxy debate. So it could actually have been any of these kind of quote unquote what they would see as kind of culture war issues, and actually didn't really very much deal with what the bill actually, the specifics of the bill. And again, I think that's something that I know that our community, kind of the broader and the minority community space, would say is that don't get distracted by these, muddying of the waters. Let's focus on what's in front of us, and let's not allow kind of proxy debates, which really are kind of, and as you say, they're not native to here. You can see that they're kind of imported. It's kind of copying and pasting. And not at all familiar with what actually is kind of the legal parameters kind of in Ireland. And in fact, it's ineffective and it's toothless, but we do have hate speech legislation as we sit here and as we speak. But it is particularly unfortunate, I think, to see the trans community being used as kind of the lightning rod for so many of these debates. And you mentioned a certain op-ed, and I won't throw too much attention to it. But a lot of the opposition, I think, is around protecting people, who come from the transgender community. And this community is one of the most marginalised and one of the most exposed, and particularly with this really vicious online kind of stuff, are most exposed, one of the most exposed groups to hate-motivated crime. So, of course, they should be protected. And again, I think the government, and I heard Mary Louie, your leader, also very much talking about, that, and it's important to see both sides or all sides of the political spectrum in Ireland being very clear on that point, that we're not going to use kind of trans people, which is just really a reinvention of how gay issues were discussed in the 1980s and early 1990s, the scaremongering, the scare tactics, the othering, and in some cases the language can be downright dehumanising. I think we do need to call that out. I'm
conscious I've paused this a little bit, but I think on the definition of gender, this is a really important point that I made in the Shannon. The definition of gender in the bill is enormously wide, wonderfully wide. It basically encompasses any concept of gender. And that's been the subject of criticism. But the point has to be made is, the whole idea is that if you're somebody who doesn't fall into gender norms, you're exactly the person who's going to be the subject of hate speech. So the notion that you'd be narrowing the definition of gender is a nonsense.
Absolutely. Before we move on, I think, Louise, there was an amendment in the Shannon where it was by Senator McDougall, and that was it was to propose to delay it until December. I think that was what was suggested. But I think certainly for us in the community, we would see that basically as unacceptable. We would see that as kind of kicking the issue to touch and ultimately maybe hoping that the bill would be killed. In fact, I've heard his amendment described as a working amendment. And we've seen those tactics used in here and in other jurisdictions as a way of kind of killing off a bill without actually, without having to kind of defend kind of killing it. That bill was defeated, but the Sinn Féin senators, Louise, did vote for the McDougall amendment, and that has caused some concern actually amongst communities. Would you like to speak to that maybe?
Yeah, and I understand the concern, and I understand the need for action, but I also understand the need to get it right. So my understanding is that the legislation has proceeded to committee stage, and there will be then the opportunity to do all of the things that we have to do with legislation. And I'm conscious that I'm not a minister, but I am a legislator, and I have seen where legislation sometimes, and I'm not suggesting this is rushed because it's not, but where legislation, it's not that it's not right, it's not perfect, it's that it doesn't do the job that it's intended to do. And I think that there's one very, very clear message coming from both the Dáil and the Shannon, is that we want to see this legislation passed. We want to see it fit for purpose. If it takes time, it takes time, but in my opinion, it's already taken, I would say, probably nearly enough time, but it's now gone to committee stage. It needs to get through that stage very quickly. But there does need to be time to consider amendments, because, I very much, and I've said this quite a lot, I believe in the wisdom of crowds. I do believe that, we don't, one person, not one party has all of the answers, that there has to be an opportunity to have that debate, to have the discussion. And also, that's a mechanism by which you can, shut up the people that we're talking about and not name them, because there's only a small few of them. And you can say, well, look, this was talked to death, it was debated to death. We looked at your amendment, we had a look at it, and it was defeated, and that's democracy. And people who put forward amendments intended to either stop it, weaken it, prevent it, or in some instances with the intention of strengthening it, making it stronger, making it more fit for purpose, and making sure that it delivers for the people who have to, who badly need that protection. And I would 100% endorse what you have said about our trans brothers, sisters, and our trans siblings and allies. It's the manner in which that particular minority have been attacked is absolutely, it's beyond shocking. It's disgusting, and it is frightening. And if I can just, a very, very brief anecdote, this is kind of where it has pushed some politicians, maybe, and I'm not going to speak for all the politicians on this platform, but where it has pushed some of us. So I was in my clinic in Balbriggan not last Friday before, and I had someone with me, and a woman came in, a middle-aged woman, she knocked on the door, and I went out to her and I said, well, you have to have an appointment, because it's only my appointments in this office. She said, grand, and I gave her my card, and she said, I said, just ring that number to get you fine. She said, fine. And as she was walking out the door, she said, you do deal with trans issues, don't you? And then she was gone. And I spent the next, so I went down to my other office in Swords, and my constituency manager said, oh, I had a lady on, she said she was talking to you, she's booked in for an appointment on Monday. This is not a joke, and I don't frighten easily. I spent the whole weekend thinking that this was a hateful person that was coming, because they have come to this wouldn't be the first time, they have come to my clinics, they always make an appointment about something very vague, and then they come in absolutely beraging. I spent the weekend thinking, oh, this is going to be, so I had people on standby. My constituency manager, she was going to ring me with an urgent appointment in case I needed to get out. One of the lads that lives in the flat upstairs, I had said to him, will you just walk past, about, give me 15 minutes. If you're walking past, just give me a knock on the door.
Isn't that quite indicative as well that politicians are now being put in that position, where that level of abuse and intimidation?
But that's what I was expecting. The lady who came to me was coming to advocate for her trans daughter. And we're working together now to try and access healthcare. That's maybe an issue we will get onto at some point. And I had to tell her, I had to say, I'm so sorry. She was a lovely lady. I just said, I'm so sorry that I thought that about you. But that was my first default response, and that is indicative of. But to me, it underlines the need to get this legislation done. By the way, but it also is indicative of how what is the word, how awful this debate has become. That was my assumption. And that woman was lovely, and she was only coming to look for some help, to get help for her trans daughter. All she wanted was my help, which I freely and gladly am giving. But I spent the whole weekend with a knot in my stomach. I do not frighten easily, but I won't be intimidated, not in my office, not in any office, not in the street, not by anybody. I spent the whole weekend with my stomach in a knot, and my husband kept saying, "Will you not just ring and cancel?" I said, "I will not cancel. I will not be told I can't."
But it's indicative though, it is indicative of, and I would say that again, it's very small, but it's an emboldened minority. And I think we need to keep that in mind. Again, the legislation I referred to at the start, the Amora research, 82% of the Irish public, and again, this is a legitimate, reputable, representative sample of public opinion, 82% of the Irish public believe that the transgender community specifically should be protected by the legislation that's being proposed. So I think that does, it's not a comfort to, you know, and you can still see how upsetting and how difficult it is for people who are the victims of this very emboldened hate. But it's a small number, and it's certainly not reflective of where Irish society is at. And I think I just want to maybe bring in Ivan, because Ivan, that you're a passionate feminist, and you've been campaigning on these issues. You know, I've said it with Ivan on my panel before. You were an ally long before it was politically popular, and I think we're coming back to that stage now where, even though I don't think public opinion has shifted, but again, I think there are moves afoot, as we've discussed, to roll back rights. And I think again it'll come a time where it won't be all one way direction. We will need allies to be in the breach and to have those difficult conversations and to stand and to have those difficult debates, if you like. But I know the trans issue, Ivana, you know, you have been really a rock of sense. You know, it hasn't compromised your support for the LGBT plus community. You know, you very much, you don't see a contradiction there. And I think actually most Irish feminist groups don't, in fact.
Thanks, Adam. And I should say, you know, I wrote a column for a while for GCN, and a big shout out to GCN, fantastic publication. And this isn't a new issue. I remember writing, and this would have been probably back in the late 90s, writing a piece about, or certainly the early 90s, about how in other countries, particularly in Britain, particularly in America, we were beginning to see at that point this sort of, you know, what I see as a false narrative of pitting feminism against LGBTQ activism. The reality is in Ireland we haven't had that, and the reason is that we have been much more conscious of our common enemy for much longer. We came to progressive politics and progressive change much later in Ireland. You know, I mean, as I said, we are this month marking only the 30th anniversary of decriminalisation of homosexuality. You know, when I was in college, it was still a crime to have consensual sex, for two men to have consensual sex, to that woman. You know, that it's so recent here that we changed the law, even that basic legal change. Obviously, marriage equality even more recently. Repeal of the 8th Amendment to legal abortion, only 2018. A law change that was brought about in the 60s and 70s in every other European country. You know, so we came to this much later, and as a result, I think, on the progressive side of Irish politics, we've been much more coherent in forming alliances. So LGBTQ activists fought alongside us on abortion rights, feminists fought alongside LGBTQ activists on marriage equality, and before that on all of the law changes. And Kieran Rose has written some superb work on all of the different legal changes that took place before repeal. Things like the employment equality legislation brought in through Labour, through Mervyn Taylor in the 90s, legislation which included sexual orientation and gender as grounds of discrimination, groundbreaking legislation actually on employment equality and on discrimination in goods and services. So, you know, we've had a long journey together, and that's why I think we're much more conscious, as I say, of the common enemy, which is the conservative forces. You know, it was the Catholic Church, probably diminished in influence and strength now, but certainly the dominant force that was preventing progressive change in Ireland for women, for LGBTQ communities, for, you know, and therefore we know what it's like. We know what the real enemy is, and I think sometimes on the left you can, you know, and in other countries certainly, you know, we've seen the right dividing, the right manipulating and manufacturing divisions among the left. I think, and I'm glad to say it hasn't happened here. No, I mean, feminism and LGBTQ activism are absolutely on the same side here, as we should be, as we are across the world, it should be across the world. And I do think these divisions are manufactured, and I think, you know, what we're seeing, and Louise and the others have pointed it out, what we're seeing with the people who are protesting against libraries, against, you know, sex education books in libraries, they are the same people who protested against COVID vaccination. They're the same people who are outside, you know, unfortunately protesting against refugee accommodation in communities across the country. And, you know, but they are only small. They aren't representative of the vast majority of Irish people, and we've seen that so clearly illustrated in the repeal vote in 2018 and the marriage equality vote in 2015. Happily for us, you know, there is a progressive set of values, I think, that we've come to share as an Irish people. It wasn't always the case, but it is the case now. We can't be complacent, of course, but we have had a different trajectory. I was recently at a socialist international grouping, transnational grouping in Budapest, and to hear about the growth of the far right across Europe and how frightening that is, how in Hungary, we say pride is a protest. It's become in Ireland more of a celebration. I remember when it really was a protest and we were being, you know, fired upon in the streets. It's back, unfortunately, it's back to that in Hungary now, and it's a protest to be out marching, and the Irish Embassy is leading on pride, on asserting the right to march in pride parades in Hungary, because we're seen now as a bastion of progressive values in Europe. So it's very positive from our point of view, but it's also a wake-up call to all of us. We can't take for granted progressive change, and that we've seen it be rolled back elsewhere, so we have to stand firm against it without overstating the support there is.
But I just wanted to, and I would say this obviously you, Ivana, as kind of a uniting in the feminist movement, but also, I mean, I consider myself a feminist in these places. And I would say this more generally, I think the feminist movement in Ireland has been so steadfast and supportive, you know, because I think LGBT plus, like at a time when being gay was illegal in Ireland, you were criminalised. Imagine that, being criminalised simply for who you were. Actually, it was the feminist movement and also the women's rights movement that really kind of supported us and that kind of held us up. Because we didn't have,
I think it's the same now, we see that here, yeah.
In the 70s, when we were, obviously feminism and the women's rights movement has been going for much longer. But I mean, the actual gay rights movement, we talk about celebrating anniversaries this year, so it's 50 years since the first gay rights movement, 1973, so it is quite that recent. But again, I think we have to pay homage to the women's rights movement and very much resist that attempt to divide us, because as you say, ultimately, that's not progressive politics. That's a zero-sum game, and it does not serve the interests of people who want to marginalise and who want to see progressive social policy.
And there is a huge amount of cohesion, I think, among feminists and people who would have been campaigning down, you know, for decades, because, you know, as Ivana says, she's right. We know who I hate these words like enemy, but we know who. No, but you're right. No, there isn't. They are. But might as well call them for what they are. There is a common enemy, and we know who it is. What really disappoints me are the tiny, and again, I can't emphasise how small this group is, number of women who I would have considered to be feminists, who now tell me that me and them, had spent our lives campaigning for women-only spaces. I mean, we didn't have Barney. That was never, you know, equality was never about exclusion, ever about exclusion. It was, and it couldn't have been, and it certainly wouldn't have had people like my parents, like my husband, like me, like my friends involved if that was what it was. So I think there's a kind of there's a fine line between recognising that we have made progress, and we have, but also never, ever getting complacent, because the manner in which women that I would know who campaigned for repeal, women who I would, up until very recently, have considered to be decent, progressive feminists, have managed to twist their own activism. I don't know how, I would hate to look back on my life and think that was what I had devoted my spare time to, that was what I had actually given you know, my own effort and energy to. I would hate that. But those women tell me that we all campaigned for women-only spaces. I mean, we didn't have Barney, we know what we were campaigning for, and it wasn't that. But I find that is...
But you only have to see the alliances, you know, and I don't spend too much time really dwelling on that, you know, those groups, but I would just say that you only have to see who they align with. You know, they align with, you know, like anti-abortion groups and other groups that would be very much on the populist right, and you know, I don't know how that tallies. You know, that kind of, you know, that you would see fit to align with people who are inherently, to your point, Ivana, as well. You know, it's, you know, and I remember reading a piece actually that you wrote about this, and it was simply you were saying, look, they're aligning with groups that no feminists should be having common cause with.
So we need to really emphasise that these are tiny. They just have a lot of email addresses and a lot of Twitter accounts, but they're really very, very, very tiny.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's so much to get through. Can I just say very briefly, because we did touch on it there, about decriminalisation. So you might have seen this week we had the publication of the working group report on disregarding convictions for gay and bisexual men. Because isn't it extraordinary to think that there are still people alive who would have convictions on their records? You know, something that I think is now widely recognised as a really egregious violation of basic human rights and dignity. I mean, I think it's one of the great injustices of the state. And, you know, I heard Kieran Rose talking, and, you know, we did import, this legislation was imported, it was part of the colonial times. In fact, most of the continuing homophobic legislation around the world, while most Commonwealth countries, for example, still have anti-gay laws, is as a direct result of British Victorian legislation. However, something I thought that was very revealing was that when the state became independent in 1922, actually prosecutions skyrocketed in the first 10 years of the independent state. And of course, we know that the state was an incredibly good house for women, for LGBT plus people, and so on. So absolutely, that law was enforced with gusto in the new state, and I think we have to take ownership of that. And I think it's why it was so important in 2018 we saw the Taoiseach giving a formal state apology to the LGBT plus community, because of course it also had a stigmatising effect even beyond the men who were directly prosecuted and imprisoned and so forth. You know, it just was really, really extraordinary. And I think it's so important that now the second leg of this, which will be the disregarding of the convictions, because I'm also very glad that we didn't go down the road of using the term pardon. I know that's what they've done in the UK, and ensuring that wonderful mathematician and gay man who was treated, I mean, beyond appallingly, you know, they call it the ensuring pardon. But a pardon still kind of insinuates that you've done something wrong. You're being forgiven. So I kind of like the way that language is important.
Kieran, this is just some of the material that Kieran has produced, Kieran Rose and the others, with the exoneration scheme and the disregard scheme. We had brought forward a bill in 2016, Jen Nash's bill, yeah. And David Norris, of course, inspired this, because he's spoken so powerfully about having to go into court and give character references for men who are being prosecuted and convicted up to 93. And as you say, Adam, there's still quite a number of men who have still got those convictions in their records. We brought forward legislation in 2016, and it's now that just this week the government announced that they would be bringing it forward. And the Minister for Finance today, when I asked him, said the legislation will be brought forward very swiftly. So they've announced they will do it. So it's going to be called the disregard scheme. And Kieran Rose has been on the working group along with others to ensure that it be brought into law swiftly. So we've got a promise on that. And, you know, just to give a shout out to Carl Hayden as well. It's just so a number of activists have been so powerfully involved in this, and really welcome to see this development this week. Along with ban and conversion therapy, which actually Clinton was leading on.
That's next on the list. You're absolutely right, and I think, you know, at a legislative front, I think Jen Nash has done a lot of good work on it. And I imagine there'll be no dissent in the Oireachtas. I would hope there will be no dissent in the Oireachtas.
See how it's done. It's just to, as you say, to move beyond the pardon idea to disregard schemes and stuff.
Yes,
I sincerely hope, good luck to anyone if there's dissent on this. I really, really, really sincerely hope that people.
Our friends in the channel.
Oh, well, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed they will just let this one go. Just pass up this opportunity, because that is a very, while we need to recognise the damage and the harm that was done by that legislation. I mean, I'm a former union official, and I know people lost their jobs and couldn't get re-employed. People had to emigrate. So the impact of it was real, and the disregard and the apology, all of those things have to acknowledge that what actually happened.
So
It wasn't,
lives were destroyed.
lives were
We can't
absolutely
say
destroyed.
any more things.
Livelihoods where people were robbed of their livelihood, their lives were destroyed, families were burst asunder. Like it was not a small thing. It was a huge thing, and it's like this.
And then I go bring it down because it's kind of conscious and we're kind of two gay men kind of family. So, and we're a similar age. I mean, I was coming of age, you could say, when the laws changed. So I wasn't obviously out, but I was coming to terms with my identity. And I'm sure it's the same for you, Ron. It's in our lifetime.
Absolutely. Well, I was 13. I don't mind owning up. But yeah, absolutely. Just at that pivotal time when you're really coming to terms with who you are. So I think when I came out in '98, so 5 years afterwards. So you were coming out in a space where literally only just become not a criminal. So I think we have to look at the huge legacy. I think it's really good to this, and absolutely would agree the work that Kieran and Carol have done and others. The other thing I'd say, I think when it comes to an apology, we need to look at the broader, obviously we're talking about people who were convicted under this law, but you had impacts on people in all sorts of other ways. I mean, the murder of Charles Self is a really good example, where you have a gay man who's brutally murdered. The investigation is absolutely lackluster, but not only that, it is pivoted around by Gardaí to become a witch hunt and to search gay men's houses and to look at it. So I mean, those terrible violations of their human rights, I think, need to be addressed as well. And I think we need to keep having this discussion as we kind of address these issues of the past. But I think it's really good news that the disregard scheme is long overdue. So.
And that's what kind of gave me a call out from Senator David Norris, of course. And David has had his health troubles, and I think it was so apt and so appropriate that he became the longest serving. I was told actually not just the longest serving senator as of I think a month ago or so, the longest serving Oireachtas member ever.
And being David, he hosted a beautiful lunch to mark the occasion. Yes, the longest serving Oireachtas member. He had just passed by one day a guy who none of us actually, I didn't know his name before, but he'd served as a senator for about,
I think he was a barrister actually.
I think he was in the 40s and 50s.
Senator. But I think, David obviously was leading this charge when it was so difficult. And of course, lost here in Ireland in a really infamous judgment. And I would, talk about knowing your history in 1983. And I know others, Micheál Martin for one, has said that it should go down actually as the worst legal judgment.
I brought some of the text of the Norris judgment with me because I wasn't sure if we were going to have time to go into the history, but at the Trinity event, we reflected back on some of the language used in the courts, and when you talk about Ireland in the 70s and 80s and into the 90s, still being a cold house for women, for LGBTQ people, you look at Chief Justice O'Higgins, the Chief Justice in the court in March 1983. So in fact, it's 40 years. This is the anniversary. Eddie McGuinness and I talked about this. This is the anniversary when we don't like to think about it because we're certainly not celebrating it. 30 years since decriminalisation. With 40 years since the Norris judgment, a shameful judgment in David Norris's case where they ruled against him in the Supreme Court. Chief Justice O'Higgins just simply saying, on the ground of the Christian nature of our state, on the grounds that the deliberate practice of homosexuality is morally wrong, that it is damaging to the health both of individuals and the public, and potentially harmful to the institution of marriage. Isn't that shocking?
Even in
and it was shocking. Yeah, no, it must be said. He spoke for the majority of the court, 3 out of 5, but 2 judges did dissent, and there were powerful dissents. And of course, the European Court of Human Rights then upheld David's appeal. But David has spoken so poignantly about the total being that litigant and out exposed.
He's been so above reproach. He talks about being so above reproach. And he ended up maybe missing the boat himself. But that's very active on, I think, and in this year of anniversaries, I think it's
just to reflect on that.
Absolutely. Now we're just going to maybe move on to another very important topic, I suppose, which is the ban on conversion practices. And that's something as well that I know a memo came before government during the week. And I think what's very welcome about that, because again, it's been in gestation for a long time. A bit like the hate offences bill, these are not, have only arisen since yesterday. And I can credit actually to your colleague, who said Senator Clinton Moorfield, and I know the ministry has actually once mentioned Clinton's bill back in, I think, 2018. Yeah. But it's so important that we outlaw this really abusive practice because it's a form of torture. And I think, and you'd be familiar with this, Ivana, with your female genital mutilation, but I think in many respects it's along the same trajectory as that bill. But basically, what this bill now will do, because we've seen in other jurisdictions where the trans community have been left behind. So I've received assurances, we've had a Pride Leader series interviews, and the Taoiseach has told me that absolutely not. In fact, they're so definitive on this point, and in fact all parties are that the trans community will not be left behind. We will not be following the example of our nearest neighbour where this is concerned. Also, as I understand it, there will be a ban on advertising that will become a criminal offence. And again, maybe kind of similar to your bit of ban back in 2012, it will be an offence to take somebody out of the state for the purpose of conversion therapy.
So, Fintan has led on this, as we said, Adam, but we did co-sponsor it with him, and certainly I worked with him because I brought the female genital mutilation bill through for the first time, made that a specific offence and criminalised the taking of a child out of the state for the performance of FGM. And so Fintan was very interested in that model because, again, this is not just about banning it here in the state. The real concern was, of course, that people would be brought away to other countries to have conversion, so-called. Again, using the language of conversion therapy is terrible. It sounds like it's like cognitive behavioural therapy. What's wrong with therapy? But of course, it's a form of torture. It's barbaric.
The United Nations, in fact, have declared it as such, and also because a lot of this so-called therapy happens within a religious setting, not exclusively so. But it's been traditionally kind of justified within that context. The UN Rapporteur for Religious Freedom has been very, very clear and explicit that whereas of course it's a human right to practice your religion, but you don't have the right to harm others through the practice of that religion. And that's a very important distinction that's recognised in international law. I mean, you, Alan, you were the first, I think, convener, the first chair of the Coalition to Ban Conversion Practices, so you're very well versed in this matter, I should say.
Yeah. I worked for a year with LGBT Ireland and in partnership with the Rainbow Project Northern Ireland on a sort of whole of Ireland campaign to ban conversion therapy. And it's right, absolutely right to pay tribute to Fintan, who did amazing work, and also the activists who worked alongside him, finding people who'd actually undergone these practices. But it's really welcome news. I think huge credit as well to Roderick O'Gorman. I think he's absolutely been pushing this, and there were some concerns that we had in the steering group that this might be kicked into the long grass, because there's still a sense out there about that doesn't really happen here. And there was a piece of research that the department commissioned and that we, LGBT Ireland and the Rainbow Project facilitated, that shows that it definitely does, but even that doesn't show the full picture. And the sort of anecdotal evidence that we have is that particular groups are especially vulnerable, and I'm going to mention LGBT plus travellers. We know that they are having these practices carried out upon them. And so it is really, really important that this moves forward. But I suppose I want to highlight a couple of things. The first thing to say is it's great that there's going to be criminal sanction. It's great that we had the indication early on, in fairness, from Roderick O'Gorman, that there would be no question of any sort of trans exclusionary aspect. And we had that after the really awful situation when the Westminster government pursued a sort of nakedly anti-trans course, which thankfully other governments, including the Scottish Parliament, we had a protest outside of British Embassy, and after that, Minister O'Gorman gave us the clearest sign that he could give that certainly that wasn't the direction they were headed. So that was very much appreciated. Really good that the jurisdictional piece is there, because I think there's two aspects to that. One is people being removed from the jurisdiction for all manner of interventions. So, those that we commonly regard as conversion practices, but also forced marriages. We know that there's a huge issue, and again, even in terms of refugees and asylum seekers that I've been speaking to, it's very, very common to find people that will just come back here, so we get you married off and we sort this problem out that you have. So it's really important that jurisdictional aspect is there, but also in terms of the North, because we know, unfortunately, Northern Ireland is one of the biggest exporters of conversion practices. And there's a parallel piece of research been done at Queen's University, which is, I think, has just been completed. There's been huge work done by the Rainbow Project and their partners in the North. But we know that there's a particular danger, particularly people in border countries, but people across the whole island of Ireland, if they can be driven 2 hours over the border, then really any legislation we might have here is useless. There's a couple of other things that I think are important, and I hope that the bill will reflect these. One is the issue of consent, because there is this, and this is, I suppose, I hope the usual suspects, the Shannon, don't weigh in on this, because absolutely not casting aspersions on all senators at all, and let's not do too much, not give too much oxygen. But I think consent is a really important issue. We had a fantastic launch of the campaign a couple of years ago, and our keynote speaker was Jane Ozanne, who's an amazing activist on this issue in the UK. And she told a personal story about being a young woman, a young cis lesbian woman who underwent an exorcism and she did this voluntarily. And she did it voluntarily because she had been brought up within this very narrow religious order and told that the manifestation of her sexual orientation was a demon possessing her. So she, quote unquote, consented to have that demon cast out. Now that's an extreme example, but I think we need to be so careful that we're clear that conversion practices in all their many forms are a violation of human rights, and so that you can't consent. So I think we need to be very clear on that. But look, it's really good news. I thought the statement in the Dáil was really good. It was really excellent to see cross-party support and politicians across the Dáil working together, and I think that's really important for us to keep, because these issues are too important to play politics with, and I think it really speaks well to our Parliament that happens.
And you'll see as well, Alan, that kind of whether it's the hate offences legislation, whether it's conversion practices, whether it's education equality, it really is the same kind of discourse. Yeah. It's the same kind of false narratives, and it's always kind of getting away from actually the thrust of what the factual position regarding the legislation. We all have to be alert to that and kind of aware of that. I think consent, actually, I might bring you in here on this point, Barry. I know that Roger O'Gorman's department is working closely with the Attorney General to kind of iron out any issues that might be there around consent. I understand that's probably the most kind of challenging part of getting the legislation right. But as Alan has rightly said, if there is kind of so-called consent for this torture, then it really would render any ban ineffective. And that's what survivors will tell you.
That's exactly right, yeah. The thing about consent is it's actually a relatively complex legal concept, because of course to remove consent is to remove people's ability to do something that ostensibly they want to do. And so there are complications that come with that. But there are lots of things already in Irish law which you are not allowed to consent to. The obvious one is murder, for example. You can't consent to be murdered. There are lots of other areas in terms of assault and things like that as well. So it's not doable. And as has been said, without putting that into the legislation, you are essentially creating something that is not operable. And the same in the jurisdictional point, particularly where we are, where it's so easy to leave this jurisdiction without even, without getting out of the car. It's so easy that if you allow those two elements in particular not to be dealt with, not to be tackled comprehensively and without any doubt in the bill, then it's going to be toothless. And again, what we were talking about earlier in the context of not loopholes, but things that might be called loopholes, removing any chance for people to circumvent the will of the Oireachtas, and by extension the will of the people. References made to opinion polls. I do fundamentally believe that Irish people are at their core pragmatic, fair people, and they see, the things that you're talking about in the concept of so-called conversion therapies, like it's really awful. It's really awful stuff. And the notion that we as a society would ever be saying that is, not even saying it's okay, but saying that it's awful, it is really wrong. So it's important that we make sure we have ironclad legislation that deals with the problem and stops it right at the beginning.
Absolutely. And we're actually going to, after bring in Louise, and then going to open it up to the floor. But Louise, you, because of course there's a North-South dimension, and Sinn Féin obviously would have a very kind of strong view on it in Northern Ireland and the Republic.
We do indeed, and we should call it for what it is. It's torture, and we should ban it. Simple as that. Put it any later.
On that note, I think, thank you very much. Look, there's so much more that we could have discussed, but I think we did kind of cover kind of certainly for this year, kind of the main policy issues. But I would encourage anyone who has any, any issue that perhaps was or wasn't raised, to come in. So if you want to raise your hand, I see Seamus Taylor,
Hi, Adam. Thank you very much.
Can we give a microphone to Seamus?
I don't think I need the mic. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Congratulations to Adam and colleagues for hosting this event, and thank you to all our speakers. I think it's been really, really good. And I commend you all and individually and for what your groupings, political and otherwise, have done. I want to go back to the incitement to hatred and hate offences bill that's going through. I've been involved with this issue. Sorry, I should have said, I'm head of applied social studies in Maynooth University. And prior to that, I worked as one of the directors at the DPP's office in Britain, and I had responsibility for hate crime policy there. And I have researched on this area of hate crime and brought out a book on it last year. I have watched and contributed to the development of the hate crime bill over the recent years in Ireland since the very earliest stages. And I commend Ivana. Before this issue was ever popular, Ivana has led on these issues. She has really been to the fore of bringing Ireland, in her own words, kicking and screaming to relative social progress. I think, Barry, you were very impressive in the Shannon. People have described you as being a bit bullish last week. I actually thought you were just being assertive in drawing on your best courtroom style. I have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed with Sinn Féin. I have watched the whole passage right the way through and been there. And in the earliest stage, when there was the pre-legislative scrutiny of this bill, Sinn Féin supported the pre-legislative recommendations. And now in subsequent developments, both in the Dáil, contributions from Pa Daly, and in the Shannon last week, I think it was a Senator Paul Gavin, I can't remember, sorry, you'll have to forgive me, indicating that they were both going to bring up amendments and vote against the bill. So, and that was Paul last week, and then you did vote last night on Senator McDowell's proposal to extend the period of time. I would view that as a wrecking amendment, and inadvertently or otherwise, Sinn Féin is getting caught up in less than progressive politics on this issue. And I wonder, are you speaking out of both sides of your mouth at the same time? Are you on the one hand being seemingly progressive and on the other hand being populist? And the area I want to particularly zone in on is the issue of what's called the demonstration test in proving hate offences. Pa Daly has spoken out against this issue, and he has said you would be bringing forward amendments on this. And he has talked about an assault, comparing two people having an assault, one being an Everton supporter and one being a black person, both of whom are drunk. They hurl abuse at each other in the context of the assault, and one calls the other an effing Everton supporter, and the other calls the other person the effing N-word. One gets done for assault, the other gets done for assault that's aggravated. I just think to bring up something like that is trivializing a serious issue. The football team we support is a choice. Our ethnicity, our sexuality, they are almost immutable characteristics. They are protected characteristics for a very good reason. And then to hear your spokesperson last week in the Shannon, and I've sat through almost all the debates, say that you would be prepared to vote against it, and again referencing the demonstration test. I would tell you that having worked in Britain on this area with hate crime cases going across my desk every day, the demonstration test is what makes this law workable and implementable. And I'll give you one example, and then I'm going to ask you a question, Louise. The example I give you is of two disabled people in a city centre in the north of England who go to a day centre together often, but sometimes don't go to the day centre and meet in the city centre and have a coffee. One of them uses a motorised wheelchair, the other person has a walking frame. This day they don't go to their day centre, they meet in the city centre in the square, they're having their coffee. They're sitting there, the sun is shining, there's lots of people around. Somebody comes cycling towards them and they could see he's becoming like as if he's aggressively cycling right into front of them. And he arrives in front of them and he lands a spit, a very big, he gathers it in his mouth and he lands it on the face of the man in the motorised wheelchair. And he kicks the wheelchair and he calls him, "You fucking mom." And he speeds off. But he's apprehended and he's brought to court. And obviously he's spat, he's damaged the wheelchair. And he says, "Oh, the sun was shining. I sneezed because the sun made me sneeze. And that's why spit landed on him." I would never be abusive to disabled people. But there were witnesses. And the witnesses said they heard the slurs that were against the person's disability. So there was a demonstration of hostility that made the conviction possible, but he was disputing it. And that's what a demonstration test does. It simply makes this law workable. But what your party is saying is that you are going to bring forward amendments and get that seek to have that demonstration test taken out of the bill. I actually think that is hugely progressive or regressive. And I would like you, Louise, to indicate, are you going to go back from here and the LGBT organisations, NGO organisations, have overwhelmingly, through the Coalition Against Hate Crime, indicated their wholehearted support for the demonstration test. So are you going to go back and your party at the next stage in the Shannon support the removal of the demonstration test, which is central to making this law effective? It's not about having loads of low-level cases. It's about a proportionate response. This law exists in Northern Ireland already. There's only about 330 cases a year, and that's what Helen McEntee made very clear in the Shannon last week. We're not talking about a flood of inappropriate cases. We're not talking about something disproportionate. But your party is, at the moment, lending itself to the perception that you're going to play it both ways. So I'd really like clarity from you on it. And I respect you as an individual politician and your contribution over time. But now is not a time for lack of clarity and lack of principle.
Thank you, Seamus. And of course, you do come from a very, as you said, a very informed kind of position. You are in the UK. Just before I bring Louise in there, I would say, like the LGBT plus community, we are overwhelming in our support both for the bill and for the demonstration test. And in fact, a pre-legislative scrutiny or spokesperson then, Martin Kenny, actually was one of those, along with the majority of the committee, who supported it because it wasn't actually originally in the bill, this demonstration test, but it was recommended by the all-party Oireachtas Justice Committee. So I suppose just, and a majority of the Coalition Against Hate Crime, it's also one of our key priorities actually, is that the demonstration test is retained. So Seamus is right in that respect. It has caused concern in the communities because I suppose, I'm sure you don't want to be seen as at odds on such a fundamental part of the bill with the groups that actually represent the minority communities who are affected. So I suppose we just want to.
I have no idea what I can do. So thank you very much for your contribution there and your question. So what I would say is I believe in parliamentary process. I've said this already. I believe in the wisdom of crowds. I do believe that we need to talk and to consider, but eventually you have to come to a conclusion and you have to come down one way or another. I know the bill went through the Dáil. I was very proud and happy to support it. And I hope that when the chance comes again that it will go through and it will go through quickly. I can't speak to the specifics of it. It is not my area. So what I can do though is I can commit to having that discussion with Pa. And I know that himself is very open to meeting people, to having that debate, and to informing our own decision-making process. I reject entirely the accusation that somehow I speak out of both sides of my mouth. I don't. I'll be very straight. It's not my area. I will have a discussion with PA about it. I was proud and happy to support it in the legislation in the Dáil. We have put forward some amendments. I'm not across the detail of those amendments. My understanding is we'll have a chance to have that debate at committee stage, which is entirely appropriate. Committee stage is also where we get to hear again from stakeholders, which I think is very appropriate. And we have shown ourselves over time to be capable of having those discussions, of taking on board and changing our views where it's required and not where we don't believe that it is. That's how we come to our decision. We are a very, very much a grassroots democratic party. We take our positions from the Ardèche floor. This is an issue that has been debated, I know, at our Ardèche. I imagine when we meet again, it will be discussed again, and we will be informed by our own members, who are the same as the people in this room, who are a microcosm of society, who are people who are interested and engaged in politics, and who want to make sure this legislation is right and it is fit for purpose. There is certainly unity among most politicians in the Dáil and the Seanad that we want legislation that is fit for purpose and that is going to do the job that we very badly need it to do. So I take on board your points, and as I've said, I will bring those back to Pat.
Thank you, Louise. And that's, that's a fair ask, I think, and that's a fair answer that you've given. So certainly, I suppose, from this gathering, I think it would be useful, I suppose, and you will to communicate that back, I suppose, both the kind of the opposition to any delay to the bill, undue delay. It will now go to committee stage, and I think that's how bills progress, and that scrutiny is important. But I suppose, yes, just to reassure the community, because I think what caused concern, I think particularly in the Seanad, was, I suppose, that that we will vote against this bill. That certainly wouldn't be where the coalition against hate crime is coming from, which again represents, LGBT, immigrants, trans community. I mean, there really is very, very strong views on this subject, and the demonstration just also.
No, I just want to make a very brief point, and it's in relation to the termination of pregnancy legislation. We were, and I was a member of the Health Committee and the 8th Amendment Committee at the time, and we came under tremendous pressure to pass the legislation, to pass it by a certain date, 1st of January, get it done, pass the legislation. I got correspondence from organisations that would call themselves progressive, saying to me, well, we know that safe access zones are not in it, and we know that it lacks all of these other issues, but pass it and pass it now. I have to tell you, we did, we passed it, we supported it. I didn't want to, because I wanted to get it right, and I felt that another month or 2 months was worth it to get it right, because now we're, 5 years down the road, still don't have safe access zones, we don't have got that finalised, and there are other issues that were left not finished. And
but
I think
that's on the fundamentals, though. I mean, certainly on the fundamentals of the demonstration test. Again, that's something that we would be very much opposed being removed from the legislation, which actually would be one of our main issues.
Yeah.
And I think, and you will bring that back to our parliamentary party, and just make that very clear. And just before I bring in Alan, just in terms, and I know because we also spoke with LGBT Ireland, with your colleague Pat Daly, and I know again we are broadly aligned on these issues. We all want to see, hate crime and incitement to hatred. So we all broadly agree. But I do think that was probably an unfortunate kind of comparison to make, in terms of, our, slurs are thrown around, and, that's what people do after, a few drinks. That didn't sit comfortably with me, I have to say, and I know that wasn't his intention. No. And then I suppose the football reference, because there was very good research done from the United States, from LGBT victims of hate crime. If you are an LGBT plus victim of a hate crime, you are 12 times more likely to feel acute distress as a result of that crime than if you were the victim of a non-hate crime. So I think it's very, very important that people listen, and you said this in your very good speech actually in the Dáil during the week, Louise. We have to listen to the people who have the lived experience. We have to listen to the people who are, rather than I suppose people projecting their own views onto what the communities think.
We know what they need.
Absolutely, and I think that's...
And when it comes to protection, we need to understand what it is that makes a person or a community feel unsafe, and what it is that can be done in legislation to give that protection.
Alan, but I'll go back to the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to thank you for your contribution, and actually just to pick up something, Louise, that you said in your speech the other day, which I was watching, which I thought was excellent. It's been mentioned already, just in terms of politicians across the board, I think, not reacting to the odd email that comes in, and I know even at a council level. Again, I'm not going to draw attention and name names, but a former, no longer Sinn Féin councillor and MMA fighter saying on various social media that he's going to fight this hate crimes legislation tooth and nail. Quite what he's going to propose to do about it, I don't know, but I think it's really, really important, and maybe that's the message that needs to go back, not just to the Sinn Féin senators, but I think to every politician in the Oireachtas, not to be swayed by a targeted campaign, and particularly, again, as we've mentioned earlier, to question where it's coming from. So the call for the delay by Senator McDowell, we know is coming from a specific place. It's being supported by particular people with a particular agenda, and we need to ensure that everyone's aware of that and calls that out. So
it's not for extra scrutiny.
It's not for extra scrutiny.
This is to actually kill that.
This is to kill
them.
Yeah,
it's a
absolutely. And another senator on record is saying she's got something like 70 odd amendments down. So I think we just need to be extremely careful, and we need to make sure that everybody is aware where that's coming from.
You want to come in there, Barry, but
I just want to say very briefly on the committee stage aspect of it. I think it's going to be a slow committee stage, sorry. So I think there will be a lot of amendments. Some of them will be difficult to stomach. But what I wanted to say was, and I said this earlier, no bill is perfect when it leaves the AG's office or when it goes through either house, and sometimes when it goes through both houses. So if anybody has an idea for a way they think they can improve the bill, I would be delighted to hear it. I'll sit down with anyone at all to discuss any amendment you want to table at committee stage in the shadow. I'd be delighted to do that.
Can I just thank Seamus for all of your immense expertise on this issue. You know, you were very helpful to us, and we were very happy to engage with you in the process of deliberating on the bill. And I do also want to give a shout out to my Labour colleague in the Shannon, Senator Annie Hoey, who I think just really did extremely well and spoke so powerfully and passionately in support of the bill. She was really excellent. You know, I was surprised that Sinn Féin or some Sinn Féin people were voting against, or rather voting to delay the bill, just because we've seen in the Dáil so many times the government using the 12-month delay mechanism effectively to sort of kill off a bill. So I think that was a concern. I think we do need to see this go ahead. There is now a clear, as you say, Seamus, consensus around the demonstration test, albeit that there were other tests that there were different views taken academically. But there's now a crystallising of view on it, and it's been really helpful to see that. But no further delay is needed. And as you finally on the abortion legislation, it was vitally important we brought that in. Women were still travelling. There was an imperative to bring that in. Yeah, but of course we need to do a lot more. We Labour put forward a strong submission to change it, to get rid of the 3-day waiting period, bring in the safe access zone law. But at the same time, we've waited so long for that legislation, for legal abortion to be available in Ireland. And I think there are promises have been made it would be passed by the first.
I was just saying that the bill
it's a different issue.
No bill is perfect, but the bill is broadly likely. The bill as it stands, we are quite, there's obviously improvements that can be made, but we are broadly very, very, we want to see the bill enacted. Anyone else have a question? Oh, quite a few. Great.
We're going to take all the questions and come back to us.
Actually, I think yes, I'll take the questions together. I'm a clinical specialist and PhD candidate in sexual health. And I was lucky enough last week to attend an a talk from the Sex Workers Alliance in Ireland. And I think we're talking about legislation and bad legislation, like the illustrate might have negative impacts, and legislation serving people that it should serve. I think the points have been made again and again, and research has shown from multiple different jurisdictions that criminalisation has worse public health outcomes for sex workers, and sex workers themselves have called for changes to that legislation, but we don't hear anything about it from legislators. And I'm just wondering, because sex workers are obviously part of the LGBT community and often the most marginalised and often migrants, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. Okay, another question? Yes.
Just in relation to thanks for coming tonight as well. It's very good to see you on here. Just in relation to the the hate speech one is, like, that going to encompass the online space as well, or is that a given?
Okay. Is there anyone else? Okay, Oisin?
Minister for Justice McEntee seems intent on introducing artificial or facial recognition technology, which poses a risk to the safety of our community, particularly that artificial intelligence can now identify members of queer populations with stunning accuracy. And if that was to be used by far-right actors or bad faith actors at any point, it places our rights at risk and the rights of other minoritized communities. So what are each of your positions on the use of artificial facial recognition?
Yes, Amanda?
Alan Rosenstein, I'm the Green Party's LGBTQI plus policy group convener. We have an 18 area policy for everyone, and thank you so much for the fantastic conversations tonight and contributions to you all. Very central area, I think it maybe hopefully not next generation, but coming up soon, is this central matter, where is education. Now, we have within that policy a commitment, and we would like to see how everyone can all work together, all of our parties, on the curriculum reform. So we want mandatory need to know information in all the core curricula, in the primary level, the FEs, the ETBs. How you could see that working together, how could bring that about. That will be a fundamental breakthrough. Thank you.
Actually, Louise, you did mention that at the start. Education was a very good point, so I continue on that. Maureen?
So my name is Portia Rice, and I work with LGBT Ireland. I want to ask you around the area of family rights and the area of family formation in particular. We've been working for a long time on the Assisted Human Reproduction Bill, which is currently stuck in the Oireachtas and doesn't seem to be moving forward. And I think it's worth us reflecting back very briefly to the marriage equality referendum. And core to that is full recognition of families and full respect for LGBT families. What we know is about half of LGBT families still being denied having full parent-child relationship with their parents. And there's real gaps in family law. In the nitty-gritty, when you get down to the detail of family law, there are real issues there. And I think this is an issue that maybe hasn't been prioritized by the government. I think some of the other issues were, and this seems to have slipped off the agenda. And this issue here, I think, is really important and really crucial for many LGBT families. And I think, but to praise Vanadacic in particular, who has been a champion of this and is working very closely with us, close the bill and close the gaps in terms of the Children's Foundations Act. So I think more broadly, when we look at the whole area of assisted human reproduction and surrogacy, that needs to be LGBT inclusive. And what we're hearing from government is there's going to be barriers to that. And many of the proposals won't be fully inclusive for our community. And many of the gay dads in particular are raising very serious concerns about the process and being forced to go through a high court process to get parental recognition, which is going to be expensive and lengthy, as well as the barriers to being closed to international surrogacy, in particular closing barriers for same-sex families. So just be interested to hear your party's perspective on these issues and how you want to prioritize and advance these issues.
So I should say, so Maureen, I have to give a shout out to him because we've worked on a number of issues and they're Copenhagen as well. LGBT Ireland, it's, I think we're all determined, aren't we, to move forwards, that we are, and I think Pride and Saturday will be testament to that. Thank you for coming along. And I might just so very briefly, just so we have a few minutes left. Oh, is there somebody else who has questions? No. I'll start with the sex work issue.
Could I just suggest we just give it round the
So, I think we've all taken a note of
Yeah,
that.
you have an overall issue.
Yeah, I'm very happy to give like a one-liner on English.
Yeah, oh, great.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, that's great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, that's what we're doing. Sorry, I didn't catch your name, but just to say that the 2017 law, which criminalised the purchase of sex, has obviously been subject to review, and we're all awaiting the publication of that government commissioned review by Moore Butler. So that's why there's been no legislative conversation. We're awaiting the culmination of statutory review. I think that could be the subject of a whole other meeting, if I may say. On the hate speech, the question about whether hate speech online, yes, that's part of the updating process. So the publication has to cover online now. Certainly in 1989, as I think a few people have said, that wasn't envisaged. Oisin, you raised the point about facial recognition technology in our party's position. It reached us. Aodhán Ó Ríordáin, our justice spokesperson, for Labour, been very strongly critical of that facial recognition technology piece and has backed the ICCL, as we all do. I'm a former board member of ICCL, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, so we would share their concerns about that. On the Green Party point, Alan, yes, absolutely right on curriculum reform and cross-party. I chaired the Gender Equality Committee, the Oireachtas cross-party committee. Last year, we produced a report in December. I'm happy to email details to anyone who would like, because we've spent a good deal of time looking at curriculum, and in particular about ensuring an inclusive curriculum that would encompass sex education, that would be and that would cover, issues around sexual orientation and around gender. So, there was a really good cross-party consensus. We built on the Citizens' Assembly on gender equality as well. So I think that process is already in train. And finally, Padraig, I want to give a shout out also to Paula Fagan, my great friend there, and to say thank you for highlighting the real problems, the real gaps still that exist for family recognition. So as you said, and you've given me a nice segue, I'll be introducing on Tuesday in the Dáil a bill to address those gaps in the Child and Family Relationships Act, in particular to address that issue about recognition of the non-birth parent in a same-sex relationship. That's a huge issue, and I'm really pleased to have been working with Maeve Largy and others in the College for Children on that. And finally, just to say that, of course, the Gender Equality Committee also recommended that we have a referendum to broaden the definition of family to cover families that are not just based on marriage. The constitutional definition is still far too narrow, and we're hopeful we'll see that referendum in November. I asked about that this morning in the Dáil and was told that the Cabinet there's a Cabinet subcommittee meeting today, so I'm hopeful we'll see an announcement very soon.
And let's be clear as well, there's going to be attempts to hijack that referendum.
And,
by huge
and may I say, Adam, absolutely, this is the campaign in which absolutely progressive forces need to strengthen our alliance, LGBTQ, feminist, progressive campaigners, because we want to see a more inclusive definition of family in the Constitution, and we want to see the gendered stereotypes around women and care in the home, which I won't go into for you, but mothers having duties in the home, no mention of fathers. That sexist language has to come out, but to replace it with the gender neutral definition of care and protection of care, but we crucially have to expand the definition of family.
And I'm going to apologise because I have to run. I get trained. If I miss it, there's not going to run for an hour. So my husband already thinks I've divorced and I just haven't bothered to actually send any paperwork. So absolutely. So on sex workers, sex work is work, and we should treat sex workers like workers. There's a lot of work that does need to be done on that, and Ivana's right, we will be informed by the review, and hopefully we'll be able to move on. But it will cover online hating. That was covered. In relation to facial recognition technology, we had a session at the Enterprise Trade and Employment Committee on artificial intelligence. We had about 2.5, 3 hours, and the whole time I was just sitting there going, there's actually not enough hours left in my life for all the things I need to learn about this. So we absolutely should not go down the road of facial recognition technology unless there are terms and conditions and caveats in place that I just don't know if it's possible to put in place. And I have really serious. I absolutely support body cameras for Garda Síochána, but the use of facial recognition technology worries me and disturbs me greatly because of its capacity to target and not understand. There's no nuance with AI, but it's running ahead of us. And if we don't do something about it, like as in soon now, or preferably a couple of years ago, we will find ourselves in a situation where we're running to catch up, and that's not where we need or want to be. With regard to education, I fully support curriculum reform. I think what we've seen in the libraries and others, it actually just underlines the need for education. And I spoke about my own family and how lovely it is to see my grandson growing up, with respect for his own body, other people's bodies, but also that level of tolerance. He's learning that in school, but that's a bit hit and miss because I have a niece who's learning the exact opposite. So we do need that curriculum reform, and it needs to be in there.
Consistent.
100%.
These are state-funded schools.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and they shouldn't be teaching disrespect or any form of hatred. With regard to the family rights and the redefinition of family, I welcome the referendum. I know that it'll probably be hijacked by referendum experts who'll also be family experts and all of the rest of it, but I think there's enough respect and tolerance within Irish society to get that referendum passed. I genuinely do. I would like to see what the good arguments are against it. We have moved on. The family is not what, I don't know if it ever was, but it's certainly not what as it is defined in the Constitution. And with regard to the assisted human reproduction bill, I was the House spokesperson in the last law, and we tried and we pushed and we pushed and we tried, and we just could not seem to get all parts of it working at the same through and working at the same time. And it was very regrettable. But there are complexities that do need to be teased out. But just because something is complicated or hard doesn't mean that you can't do it. So I do think all of that work coming together should make a real and appreciable difference. But I think it must be quite terrifying for parents to not have those rights, to be the parent that doesn't have those rights. I think it's really, really, really scary, and we do need to deal with that in a compassionate way, and recognising some of the damage and the harm that was done, but also trying to fix it for the future. And I have to apologise, but I do unfortunately have to go. So Louisa, thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, thanks. Just on the sex workers thing, I agree with what I said. I'm looking forward, I think, to a great I'm the Vice Chair of the Justice Committee. I think there's a great opportunity going down the track for us to deal with this in a way that I think previous governments certainly and offices have been afraid to do. I think the time is coming and I'm looking forward to it. But no answer for you today, so it's going to take a little bit of time. In relation to the hate speech bill, Section 6.1 defines information systems in the same terms as the Criminal Justice Offences Relating to Information Systems Act 2017. It not only, therefore, updates the legislation to include the internet and the context factor, but it also has extraterritorial effect. So it means that while in 1989 we were concerned about people standing in Grafton Street with bits of paper handed out to them, now you can launch that campaign from a computer in America or a computer anywhere in the world. It'll still be in effect. So the bill will have extraterritorial effect for anybody feeding that stuff into around as well. So yes, it's updated and does both of those things. F14 is a vexed question, but I think it's also subject of an awful lot of misinformation. You are quite right that it's flawed, and lots of aspects of F14 can be used specifically to target, for example, not just members of LGBTQ plus community, but people who are ethnically different, women. You know, it can be used that way, and it has been used that way in America. And we saw problems in Boston and San Francisco. However, what I would say to you is this: they were specifically in the context of real-time application of the technology. So you have a cop on the beat in San Francisco with a body cam, picks up Barry Ward, beep, 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 we've a warrant for his arrest, bring him in, whatever, and the cop goes, collars him, brings him down to the station, the process goes from there. And of course, in America, you don't have a criminal justice system, you have a criminal injustice system, so you have all kinds of other problems. There is no suggestion that F14 will be used in Ireland in a real-time scenario. So body cams, everybody supports. They're an important tool to protect Gardaí, to protect the people they interact with, because Gardaí are not immune to being overzealous, as we all know, and they protect all of us. So they're a good thing. But it is not suggested that you will have that system where in real time the camera will identify you as complying with some database feature or whatever it is. That is not part of the proposal here. The primary function of the F14 proposal, and I see you shaking your head, Oisin, so I'll let you go back in a second. But Helen, there was a rumour last weekend that Helen was going to separate this into the bill. That's not going to happen now, as I understand it. And in fact, that didn't come from her. That was somebody else. But the primary purpose of F14 in this bill that's coming through for the recording devices bill will be to use it as a data processing tool for Gardaí. So you have something that happens and you have hundreds of hours of CCTV that have to be watched, rather than Detective Mary Murphy sitting down and going through all of those hours herself. And also, by the way, making the same human errors that we all make. F14 will be used like pressing Control F in a document to find a face. That's one application. More importantly, you might have a face and you don't know who it is. You can put that through all kinds of databases that are used by Europol, Interpol, still subject to the data protection, General Directive of Data Protection that we're all subject to in Europe as well. So those protections are still there. But crucially, whatever result comes back from that technology is subject to a human person, a guard, saying, yes, that's Barry Ward. I'm not telling you that's Barry Ward, or whatever it is. So there is a little bit of misinformation about that. I am not concerned about F14 being targeted at people, because the technology itself cannot target itself. It can only be targeted by a person. There's no opportunity.
so we have very, very strong views on it.
Yeah.
So does Ocean. It's an
I
issue.
suspect we're on different sides.
It's becoming increasingly prominent, so I think that's a conversation that perhaps will continue. The clarification, or sorry, the report in the news earlier in the week that it's going to be separated out, you're saying that wasn't true?
My understanding is that is not true.
So it's still going to be all in
Yeah,
one.
because we got permission at Cabinet on Tuesday to get them through.
We have agreement from the minister on Tuesday night, it's to be separated out.
I think it's, yeah, I'm totally out of the picture. I spoke on Tuesday afternoon with somebody from Justice who told me they were going together, so your information might be more updated. We haven't had this Justice Committee yet. So.
Alan is chomping at the bit.
Anyway.
Well, I'm just looking at the faces, people look thirsty, so I'd be really.
Here, here.
Yeah, no, I'd be really quick. Nothing really to add to what's been said in terms of this with sex work. It's safe to say that in terms of a lot of what we've been discussing, I think it's really, really important that we're not just dealing with legislation, we're also dealing with a response from lawmakers and healthcare professionals and others, which is competent, and particularly competent in respect of minority groups who may be particularly vulnerable and susceptible, and that includes sex workers, includes members of the traveling community and so on. So I think it's really, really important. In terms of actually the online hate and the AI, I might take together, because I think we could have an entire panel discussion on the issues online. I think it's really, really important that we address this. I don't think we're addressing it enough. Just a tiny anecdote. I get perhaps not as much hate directed at me as a TT, but I did when I had a fundraiser in response to Enoch Burke's protest, and I was getting a fair amount of hate, and I looked at the Facebook profile of one of the individuals and went through the public timeline, and it was all matters which I would view as being caught by hate crimes legislation, anti-Muslim, just racist, bad stuff. And as an experiment, I reported it all, each and every one, and each and every response came back. This does not violate our community standards. So we need to be really, really clear. Not only do we need to ensure that our legislation is tough enough, but we've got social media companies who aren't regulated at all, and they're certainly not capable of regulating themselves. And we need. You just can't understate how important this is to our democracy. I mean, this really is an existential crisis. The other issue in terms of education, I think is a point really, really well made, and it's just maybe we didn't get a chance to discuss it. I want to give a shout out, if I may, and other groups that do amazing work. But as ever, I think we delegate too much to volunteers in this country. But by the same token, we're blessed by the volunteers we have. They do amazing work. I think the news of this can't come quickly enough. In terms of the situation we're facing, where librarians are somehow now at the battle lines of a culture war, we in South Dublin County Council are for the first time taking part in the Dublin Pride March with a mobile library, which I actually think is really, really important, and I'm really, really proud that I'm going to be marching alongside them, because it's so important. And I think what we really need to do, as well as changing the syllabus, is to educate people more generally that giving your kid more information in a safe environment is never a bad thing. This idea that ignorance is safety should be completely and utterly
censorship. If every censorship is inappropriate, it's an library. And then when there's a hate, when there's kind of the anti-LGBT kind of behind that even more. Just very brief, finally, just to say before we sum up, Twitter today might have seen the Australian Data Commissioner, Online Safety Commissioner, has really fired a really strong kind of salvo at Twitter, saying they will not be fined. They've absolutely said they are contributing so much to the proliferation. That particular platform is contributing to this hate and to this extremism. And I think we need the same thing here. So it's the online safety bill, an online safety commissioner who has teeth, and then also when crimes are tip over into that incitement, they should be robustly prosecuted. So yes, can I thank everyone for coming along? We went a little bit over time, but I think the debate probably merited that. Clearly, we're a community with very strong views and opinions, and I want to thank my panelists. I want to thank Ivana Babchik, I want to thank Senator Barry Ward, I want to thank Louise O'Reilly, who's here, and Councillor Andrew Edge. So have a wonderful Pride on Saturday. It's more important than ever that we go out onto the streets and that we're visible and we're proud. And also, I think this is the time for allyship, and this is the time for making clear that Ireland will not go backwards, we're going to continue going forward. Thank you, everyone.